A warm welcome to all our viewers, to our series Natural Medicine Today. Today we're talking to the head doctor at the Sonnenberg Clinic about how I can eat to keep my brain fit. And Alexandra Kotthaus takes us holistically into the deep possibilities, also regarding the topic of detoxification, prophylaxis and optimal brain supply, and that's why I'm happy that she's here today. Stay tuned. Hello dear Alexandra, nice to have you back.
Thank you.
Dementia or Alzheimer's, or we also have people who are now suffering from the consequences of the virus who say, I have an incredible lack of concentration. So all these things that now really put the focus on brain function.
Also es sind ja alles Dinge, die jetzt wirklich ein bisschen so das Augenmerk mal auch auf die Gehirnfunktion legen.
And therefore the question for you now, is it the brain that is the problem, or is it the environment that triggers the brain?
Oder ist es das Umliegende, was das Gehirn ansteuert?
That's a nice template. Exactly, in the body everything somehow belongs together. And when I say it like that, you say yes, of course. I can influence my brain in so many different ways. The brain is protected on one side by the meninges. Of course, I've touched them before. It is of course a rough affair. So the brain is already really well protected somehow. Nevertheless, there are connections into the brain, because the brain needs to be taken care of. Not just with nutrients, but it can sometimes be the entry point for things that are not supposed to get into the brain. Exactly, you have already made this gesture so beautifully. Or are there other things to add? I immediately thought, hey look, you know, the brain or the nerve fibers, if you imagine it, the brain, then the spinal cord comes out here, cranial nerves come out here. Those to the head sometimes pull a little deeper and then nerves come off all over the spine. And also the nerves. Then there is a sympathetic nerve cord adjacent to the spine, outside the CNS. So the central nervous system, that is the part that has a bony shell and has these solid meninges, and everything that comes out there. So if the nerve has left the spine, then it's the peripheral nervous system. But most of what I just said is actually wrong, and your gesture just right. It usually goes like this. Almost everything goes to the brain. There are people, researchers, investigators who say 80% of the fibers, that means that little thing, axon, which is wired from bottom to top, or in between and runs up. 80 to 95% of the nerves go from the periphery to the brain. So please let it melt on your tongue. Most of it goes to the brain, and not the brain gives impulses to the body. It does too. But the brain mainly collects impulses. So the way is mainly the other way around than it is in most ideas. So your gesture was spot on. And that also means that I can influence the brain in many ways. I gave a lecture many years ago, when I was still working in psychiatry. We did internal training on mental and neurological diseases and exercise. How closely the musculoskeletal system is also related to brain health in terms of neurological or psychiatric diseases. It starts with the fact that someone once took the trouble to investigate whoever exercises 3 times for 20 minutes, and we're only talking about 20 minutes of endurance sports, every week can have the same effect for 3 months, and then stops again, the same effects as if they were taking an antidepressant for 3 months. Plus, after a year the effect of the antidepressant is completely gone. Of course earlier, you can still measure this effect of 3 months, 3 times a week physical activity for 20 minutes. That's how sustainable it is.
How would you explain that now? Because of the sweating, 20 minutes, 3 times, that's several factors. Is it the serotonin or the hormone stories, or that the body is also detoxifying, or about the mitochondria?
With 20 minutes, I don't really have that intensively. I might not even break a sweat, but it goes much further. For example, if now a Parkinson's patient is in freeze mode, so they suddenly go like this, then it's like they're depressed. As soon as they can move again, they are no longer depressed. Well, I don't think it's about these secondary effects that you've just listed, but really the movement itself has a direct impact on brain function and also on emotions. As many people say, when I go hiking, it clears my head. Hiking is nice from the body's point of view, but not even a special effort, or that the body would say, hey, you've done exercise now, unless you really have to go up the mountain. But I'm not at the sports level yet with sweating, with the detoxification, but I'm just moving. I can also sit on the exercise bike, on the ergometer, and read a book, and then, I haven't tried it yet, because I don't find this so attractive, reading a book on the home trainer, that then you can remember the content better. It is known that children who are just free to play can balance outside, so not like, no, you can't climb on it now, but like, do it now, they'll be better at math later. So we are so complex, so networked with our brain. It's not just a part of us somewhere.
Now we also currently have the situation that one or the other person slipped a bit into depression, or I had cases here and there in my circle of acquaintances where older people then got medication, which then even caused a certain confusional state.
Die dann dazu geführt haben, dass auch so ein gewisser Verwirrtheitszustand verursacht wurde.
How would you go about that? I could just imagine this wild drug cocktail of antihypertensives, antidepressants, and what else is mixed in with them, simply put such a strain on the body that it might make sense to do a cleanse, right?
Einfach den Körper so belastet, dass es vielleicht mal Sinn macht,
to do that a little, with the accompaniment of a doctor, of course, logically.
That's an issue, yes. I'm a psychiatrist. We always have over 80-year-olds deprived of so-called benzodiazepines. So the classic sleeping pills, the less classic sleeping pills, which are simply prescribed very often, unfortunately too much in the general practitioner field. Of course, as a GP, I also have a closer bond with my patients. I don't want the patient to suffer, and they say I can't sleep. I really can't sleep. And then, unfortunately, the patients get such a chemical. It doesn't necessarily have to be the worst, but benzodiazepine, what can then accumulate in the fat tissue in the case of a metabolism that no longer works so quickly? They are stored in fatty tissue, the substances. So the first few nights, I might have broken down the stuff the next day at some point. But it accumulates. And then I also know older ladies, or they have just become widows, then everything is much worse, and then they take another pill a day, and then instead of 1 in the evening they are already at 3 a day, and at some point someone will say, you're a bit confused in the head or something, and grandma always forgets so much. And then we had, actually mostly women, in psychiatry for detoxification, and then you saw, oh look, she wasn't demented at all, but she had an overdose of pills. Please do not try this at home alone. Depending on how someone's metabolism is, also how much adipose tissue they have, it stores itself in adipose tissue, and that takes time until it really is empty, dismantled. That can take 6, 8 weeks, and then after that time there can be rebound phenomena. That means, perhaps something like psychotic things can come out temporarily. You just have to know that. You have to be able to manage it, and therefore, it must be accompanied. And blood pressure meds, same there. Then we have the women, on the one hand. It's just that they pay more attention to their health than men, often being more disciplined about taking their blood pressure medication. And what I also often experienced, the women, mostly those who didn't need it at all, who simply weren't overweight at all, they then ate less salt and were particularly healthy. Up to maybe low salt, depending on which blood pressure medication you get. Still promoted so easily that the blood pressure is then simply too low. Or you don't always have the same daily form and then they become dizzy, shaky, then to the point of falls, syncopation, so fainting spells, collapsing. Difficulty concentrating, tiredness, brain fog, sometimes simply because the brain is not well perfused. And there it's also true that you don't need to feel a false sense of security. Now, when I take blood pressure medication, it doesn't prolong survival for most people. Maybe a little less likely to have a heart attack or a stroke. Nevertheless, they do not live longer, but the people who naturally lower blood pressure live longer. If I now beat down an old person's blood pressure below 130, maybe even around 120, then I have to assume that I always have situations where the blood pressure is even lower, 110, 100, and that is no longer enough for many older brains to have a good perfusion. That means the blood flow is less, the oxygen supply is less, cognitive performance decreases as a result, the risk of falling is increased. So if I mean too well for old people and blood pressure medication, because I really want to reach the normal value, I often shorten their life, or bleeding, cerebral hemorrhages occur. And that's a wave now, it's sloshing over from America. They simply lowered the standard values for cholesterol, blood pressure, and sugar. Then I have American patients who then have a blood sugar of 106 and say, I have blood sugar values today, we absolutely have to do something about the blood sugar. Well, then show me. By the way, the normal range for us is 120. And that's something too, we'll have to see what's spilling over there. These are often such extreme waves, and yes, of course there are studies that say when I have 120 over 80, that's great. Then the kidneys are protected, but only if I get it naturally, not if I force the body to do it. Then I'll pay always a price for it, so to speak.
I've always had women describing a bit of a type change or emotional imbalances in their husbands when they then get or start the antihypertensive drugs, that they really have an influence on the psyche, on resilience. There are more rages out there, or here they say since he's been taking things, he's lost his mind again. Especially when I talk to people, I have always discovered that it also led to this.
By now it is actually known, I think it used to be ignored a lot more, that blood pressure medication can cause psychological changes, quite a lot too. Especially the beta blockers, sleep disorders and other problems, but also the other drugs can trigger depression, for example. In men, depression is more likely to manifest as irritability, not necessarily this being lethargic or sad, but really it can be increased aggressiveness initially.
How do you manage to increase the blood flow to the brain in the clinic right now? I actually find that an interesting factor, don't you? Because then I can also help break down heavy metals or, if there are inflammatory processes in the brain, somehow support the healing process.
Oh, there are a lot of possibilities. The easiest thing to do in the consultation for yourself at home is of course nutrition. There are foods that straight after consumption influence the vascular elasticity and the constriction or rigidity of the vessels. There are dietary supplements that encourage blood flow. So with nerve issues, I'm incredibly fond of giving alpha-lipoic acid. Turmeric is also very useful for the brain. I have to think about the B vitamins, especially B12. So it's also very easy to fish out B12 deficiency, or someone is coming that has already been clarified. Yes, you are not B12 deficient. Then the serum value was measured. it is 260 and normal range may be 180, depending on the lab. You are not B12 deficient. If I use that value, then I can also toss a coin. And even my neurological boss at the time said, yes, a value below 400 is neurologically not possible. And he wasn't even focused on orthomolecular medicine, where you have to say it's just a really bad value, to measure it and to determine the defect. But I also need B1, I need B6, I need folic acid for the brain. And then we have options. We have a microcirculatory infusion that improves the blood flow down to the smallest vessels, improves oxygen uptake in the cells. We have an Indiba device. That's a kind of local hypothermia, which you can use with a certain technique to target the CNS in such a way that I simply promote blood circulation and regeneration. Of course, if I promote blood circulation somewhere, then I always have a better oxygenation, so supply of oxygen to the tissue, but of course not only the transport of oxygen and good things, but also the removal of bad things works better. When I use heat, every degree more is a doubling of the metabolic rate. And we still have the big heat treatment, that whole body heat treatment using infrared A radiation, where one has to say, the infrared A radiation, we have another option, to use the infrared A radiation, makes an improvement in mitochondrial function, an increase in microcirculation. Growth hormones are poured out for the nervous system, hormone balance is reacted to. So I already have that from the infrared radiation alone, plus, I cause a fever. And if I'm in this fever range, then I have again effects that come along. So it is an incredibly profound detox effect. There are few measurements or studies that have examined sweat. But in sweat and when you take blood at the same time, I have a much higher concentration of toxins in sweat than in blood. So it's a way to detox. Then some say I have an infrared sauna at home. Great, definitely use it. Really, really, really great. But it doesn't come close to the fever therapy in terms of intensity, where I also have an immune modulation.
During fever therapy, what is the internal core temperature?
We measure that in the target range, is that you should get to 38.5 degrees. The fever starts at 38.5 degrees Celsius. And not as some people think. I took a temperature, my child has a temperature of 38 degrees Celsius. That's not a fever yet. So that's really not a fever. And a little digression, dear mothers, there is even a study about it. Mothers can measure the temperature by touch of hand. Pretty accurately, they can say that that's fever, that's not a fever. And when I lower fever, I never base fever reduction on the temperature, but always on the clinical condition of the child, but that's another topic. No, we monitor core body temperature, we then keep it within a certain range, and measure oxygen saturation and heart rate. We then see in the ascent phase, which can be very strenuous at times, as the heart rate increases. And for someone who regulates well or regulates halfway well, it goes down again when they have a fever. So then I overcame the stress reaction, and then it's fine.
As a psychotherapist, do you accompany this process? Because I could also imagine, I've also heard from here and there that for some really a bit of subliminal topics also come up, because in a fever process that often happens to us too, personal development, also in children. Could you apply the same thing now also on adults, that we have something like a reset, a bit on a psychological level?
Absolutely, yes. I'm not the person sitting next to them during fever therapy. It's our therapists and assistants, and they are very fit and trained there and accompany the patient. And one wants to talk, the other might just want to listen to soft music. Some want to listen to rock music, but we recommend relaxing a bit more. That's actually better. But time and time again, we have the experience that the patients might have to cry, or just feel the need to talk about certain things. We once had a patient who did many hypothermia treatments, the basic disease was just also accordingly. She was able to let go, cried and talked, quite often. And at some point it was good.
And could you then perhaps also recognize from the synchronicity that the body was then also well detoxified? That the illness and the whole issue then stabilized at a different level?
Yes.
Where the emotional was also cleared up?
Well, there are so many processes running at the same time that it's difficult to say that it plays a role. But we rarely only start at one point.
Would you know, for someone who is actually okay, healthy, but there may be a few hormone imbalances, or they know, okay, poisoned, then maybe even had an amalgam, say preventively, even 2 or 1 hypothermia a year doesn't hurt?
It's my favorite therapy anyway. I do this for myself too and notice that it's good for me. And once or twice a year is great prophylactic therapy. We also offer a 3-day immune training with local and whole body hypothermia, where it's just not the idea, you come 3 days in a row. You can too, but you can really spread the days over the year as prophylaxis and immune training. A very nice study on fever therapy. They only did the therapy once in 3 months compared to infusion therapy. Unfortunately, I have no further information about what that was, and just oral intake of detoxification things, and they measured the DNA adducts. So dirt deposits on the DNA. And there, with only 6 applications in 18 months, so once in 3 months, fever therapy is best.
What about the older people? We were just on the subject of dementia. If now really an older person is already slightly stricken, can I expect them to do this fever therapy? Or if someone has already had a stroke or diabetes?
Those aren't contraindications, just the heart. It's already a cardiovascular strain. That must be okay. The stroke may not necessarily have been recent, but an acute existing cardiac insufficiency, that would be a contraindication. That means that the doctor has to examine the patient beforehand, perhaps write an EKG in cases of doubt, or arrange for further examinations. But basically, I would say, this is such a great therapy method that it may be worth it. And then you can also put older people on it. We do that too. I just have a patient who is in her mid-70s and where I just said, for example, watch out. To the colleagues, every degree counts. If she gets into the fever range, that's okay. You don't have to get her there. With some patients, sure, I want the fever range, but even if I just have the infrared A effect on her, and that 1 degree more in the body, so twice the metabolic performance, I've already gained a lot. The patient is now also dealing with a histamine problem, where again, I can have a great effect on it with the infrared. But we also do it with older people.
That's also such an exciting topic. Finally, because we're running out of time again, it's so exciting with you. I could actually talk for 5 or 6 hours. A few more parameters for the brain. We have already heard supplements with B12 and all the B vitamins. What else is there for the brain, like the top 10 foods, where you say that there is definitely a good supply?
Berries. First of all, berries, berries, berries. Especially wild blueberries. The brain also likes electrolytes, so that means minerals, salts. By that I don't necessarily mean eat a lot of salt. You can get that from fruit and vegetables. With the carbohydrates, I see this topic critically. I am generally in favor of good carbohydrates, not necessarily limiting them in quantity, and of course totally against bad carbohydrates. And you have to say, there are studies that say fructose is totally stupid. However, then usually comes the step, this single substance is now transferred to fruit. Unfortunately, That's terrible, because fruit contains more polyphenols, antioxidants, which is what I need up here. What I need also in Parkinson's, because these polyphenols eliminate the accumulation of xenoestrogens in Parkinson's. In some countries, Parkinson's is an occupational disease of farmers. So the pesticides do that. This is one of the 3 most dangerous jobs in the world, being a conventional farmer. This means that if I want to protect my brain, I need polyphenols. There are already studies that say that someone who at least drinks a juice from the package, a fruit juice, does better than the one that has no fruit. But as I said, don't generalize that now or drink lots of fruit juice. That's not what I want to say, just to raise awareness of the topic a little.
What do you take as an omega-3 source? What's your favorite?
I did the math for myself, and I get what I need through what and how I eat, without adding a drop of fat. And I am at 1 to 2 grams of omega-3 fatty acids. Through a big portion of wild blueberries, which is on my daily schedule, through quite a large amount of raw, leafy greens. So there are significant amounts of omega-3 fatty acids in them. And also other fruits and vegetables, or spirulina powder contain omega-3 fatty acids. After a long search, I have found a table in vegan diet. Where do you get your omega-3 fatty acids from? I'm not a real vegan, but mostly plant-based is almost an expression that I would prefer to vegan. So I just want to say that it's possible, 1 to 2 grams a day, and you can actually increase the amount with lots of little tricks. For example, if I use linseed oil, but please always be careful there, the quality has to be right. It has to be stored in the fridge. It has to be used up quickly. If it's bitter, stay away. But so do flax seeds. There is enough evidence, studies that indicate that even if I use flaxseed without crushing or pressing, enough omega-3 gets into the body. Or I'll sprinkle half a teaspoon of hemp seeds over food, plus another balanced diet. Then I can already achieve something. Although, I would just like to say that it works through food, but with neurological illnesses, I still add omega-3 fatty acids.
Now we're running out of time. Unfortunately.
To be continued.
I would be so happy if you came again, because there are still so many topics that I would like to shed light on with you again, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, super exciting what you can do today to get your body back in shape, to support detoxification and to supply the brain with the important things. And I hope you were able to take something with you, and thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye.